So our Old Testament lesson is from Job 38 this week, and it's in the middle of God's answer to Job. At the end of the book of Job, God's answer takes a few chapters, and Job has a very significant response to God in these chapters, as well as he deals with the answer to his questions. So let's read it as it's printed as a responsive reading. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand.
Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know.
Who stretched a measuring line across it? And on what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone?
While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy.
Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb?
When I made the clouds its garment, and wrapped it in thick darkness.
When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place.
When I said, this far you may come, and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt.
Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place?
That it might take the earth by the edges, and shake the wicked out of it.
The earth takes shape like clay under a seal.
Its features stand out like those of a garment.
The wicked are denied their light.
And their upraised arm is broken.
Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea?
Or walked in the recesses of the deep?
Have the gates of death been shown to you?
Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness?
Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth?
Tell me if you know all this.
Okay, and now the reason why this passage is chosen for the Old Testament, again, remember Old Testament gospel always connect, and it's Peter walking on water, but significantly when Jesus gets in the boat, the winds die down. So in the middle of this passage, when he talks about speaking to the waters and telling your proud waves to halt, okay, that's the connection to the gospel lesson. First question is, when did you ask questions of someone underestimating their capacity and ability? You got one right away.
Oh my gosh, yes. When my niece got married, her husband is from Bosnia. And they got married here in the States, and his family came for the party, came for the wedding. And I went to meet his mother, and she said, hello. And I was like, hi, how are you? I'm Katie, I'm Jean's aunt, and all this. And she just looked at me with this blank stare. She knew hello. That was it. And she's gotten better in the 25 years they've been married, but it was just like, oh, sorry. Yeah, my bad.
And it was overestimating.
Yeah, that's
Right, exactly. I overestimated her ability. She's much better now. Well, and I knew she was a nurse, and she lived in Germany. She speaks German beautifully. She speaks Croatian beautifully. She just didn't speak English at all.
Anybody have an underestimating?
When I asked Ed to marry me, I underestimated his ability to say no.
You asked him.
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
Yeah, not real, but
Well, and so underestimating someone's ability, my nephew Aaron, who we were praying for, you just make a comment about a dinosaur, and you will find out everything there is to know about any dinosaur out there, how to correctly pronounce their names and what they look like and where they lived and all that. I'm like, okay, you're really into dinosaurs, Mr. Yeah.
yeah.
This is a negative though. I've had a few students who, they come into my class and they think they know everything.
Yeah.
You know how that goes.
No, there's nobody like that in college.
They think they know it all.
Evidently like that.
And if I'm fortunate and they do listen and they do learn, and then they come back at the end of the semester and say, wow, I learned so much more. But I had a few who just decided to not come to class, and yet they couldn't understand why I flunked them.
Yeah.
I said, you didn't
Excuse me?
Yeah, excuse me? So, yeah.
Yeah, and in that case, sometimes they overestimate their ability. On the other hand, you know, you shared often that anybody can draw, right?
Yeah.
And many people underestimate their own capacity to be able to do something, and then they're surprised
When they can.
when they can.
So, like I was talking to a few colleagues before, and it's, on Tuesday, and it's not that I'm gonna make you an artist, it's not that you're gonna learn how to draw. The question is, are you capable of doing it? And so I have this little exercise I do, and the idea is that you don't say, well, you could never teach me. So when I'm done with this little 3-minute exercise, now I say, are you capable of learning? And they have to admit, yeah, I can see where, but then you spend all semester practicing all these things, and then you can. But the thing is, it's so many people who just say, I can't do this, and I can't stand it when they say,
Right.
I can't do this. It is, it's possible, everyone can, it's just that you just don't know the ins and outs of it. That's
I had a farmer in my first congregation who'd say, "Can't a sluggard too lazy to work?" That was his constant response when somebody said, I can't.
Yeah.
Can't is a sluggard too lazy to work. Yes, you can, you just need to work at it, is basically what he was saying. He had other sayings so much I can't repeat.
Well, I had, on that line, I had a friend who used to say, you gotta wanna.
Yeah,
If you don't wanna, you're never gonna do anything.
Exactly.
You gotta wanna.
right.
That's what she used to say.
What have you found, the second one is just thinking about some of the things God's talking about here. What have you found to be the most awesome thing about the natural world? The natural world is kind of.
I watch a lot of those programs on PBS about the natural world. The only thing that disappoints me is they always have to put this evolution thing in there.
Yeah.
It is so complicated. I'm just amazed that they don't see, nobody threw this thing up in the air and it just fell into place. Just everything is just so complicated and meshes so perfectly into where we have it. And the other thing is all these people are, we have to save this and we have to say, yes, you do, because God said we were supposed to take care of the earth. And just because people have messed it up doesn't mean that you're noble in now you're gonna fix it. That's what you're supposed to do in the first place.
Yeah.
That's what God told Adam to do.
And manage it when other things change. You know, I just had this discussion with James because we talked about all the lakes we have here. Well, why do we have all these lakes here? Well, part of it is because the glaciers were down about where we are, you know, and so you got the Kettle Moraine, the North Kettle Moraine, the South Kettle Moraine, you got all these kettles, and where did all that come from? And you forget that, yeah, right now it's kind of warm out, but at one time, it was really, really cold, you know, and I think things for me were like seeing the, you know, Rockies the first time,
Oh, it's amazing.
you know, the Grand Canyon, that's an amazing hole in the ground, you know. When you see the ocean for the first time,
Just even seeing Lake Michigan and realizing it's a lake,
it's a
an
lake,
ocean.
not an ocean, yeah.
Right, exactly.
You just made me think of, we went to California, 73 I think it was, and a friend of ours took us up, out of the city, and I was first of all amazed at the rolling hills and the greenery. I was used to Florida, flat land and sand, and I was surprised at how beautiful it was. And then he led us through this forest, which you came out of the forest and you were on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
Oh.
And that was stunning. It was just stunning. And of course, he has to start climbing down. But yeah.
What were you thinking?
I really felt like you really feel like I know my position in God's world. It's quite wonderful, but it's not as big as this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately what we're all talking about is that it always surprises us.
Yeah,
There's
it's
always
a
something
surprise.
you've never seen
You've seen before, yeah.
That's true.
How big or how small, you know, like, I was at my sister's on Friday and the kids were like flipping out because there was a tree toad on the back of the lawn chair. And they're all like, look at that, that's the coolest little toad. And it's like, yeah, they're really noisy. But, you know, it's just one of those things where every time you turn around, you see something you've
Awe
never
and
seen
wonder.
before.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
When you're a kid and you're lying down in the grass and you watch an ant.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite wonderful too.
And my neighbor was just talking about, we have a little girl in the neighborhood who's like probably 10 months. So she's starting to see the world around her. So you watch her mom taking her for a walk and she's going down the street like this. You know, looking at all the trees and all the birds and all that kind of stuff. And you can just see the wonder in her eyes. It's amazing.
Those of you who might remember Janet Carter,
Mm-hmm.
when her oldest daughter Rachel was born, and she was just a baby, and she went out for communion and took the baby with her. And Rachel is like this, look. And she was a tiny baby.
Yeah.
I mean, I was afraid she could put her head up.
Around.
Wow.
Where'd all you people come from? I was way in the back of the church.
Well, holding a newborn baby is one of those times too, when you think about not just the natural wonders of nature, but that's a natural wonder in a little different way. Yes. All right, so a lot of nature. So what's the significance of God answering Job out of the storm? And it's just interesting for context. In chapter 38, verse 1, it says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm." Now, if somebody would read verses 1, 2, and 3 for us again of chapter 38.
Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me."
Now that's interesting start, right? Who do you think you are? You know, and I couldn't help but think when you were talking about that, those students who seem to know more than, you know, when they come into class. I don't know about you, but I got a number of faces that pop up, especially in college and at seminary, and we had one really obnoxious one at seminary, and it was in a history class, and Heino Kadai was the name of the professor, and he always just sat with his hands. He had a little bit of a belly, sat with his hands on his belly, and very quiet kind of guy. But he would just put this guy in his place. and you could tell everybody else was enjoying it. You know, when he said something that just, he obviously didn't have a full context or a full understanding of what he was saying. And, well, you know, he would start and then he'd kind of just really put him in his place. And I think all of us were silently cheering. You know, who do you think you are? And you find the same kind of context a little bit later on as he's speaking to Job again out of the storm. If you turn to chapter 40, and this is in response to something Job says, and somebody want to read verses, let's take 6 to 9. Yep, go
Then the
ahead.
Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. "Raise yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself?" How far?
Just one more.
"Do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his?"
Yeah, who do you think you are? Right? Okay. So from the way God answers Job here, who's really on trial? What if, and this is one of the difficulties with reading a passage like this, if you read the whole book of Job, you know that he had 3 friends who came to him who were always telling Job what was wrong with him and what he needed to do different to try to please God and get God on his side again. And none of them gave him good advice. And Job wouldn't hear what they were telling him. And he really complain sometimes about God, and you could see that. And do we all complain about God sometimes? I don't know about you. I would say one of the greatest things about the Psalms is that you hear the psalmist complaining to God. And it's in the Bible, so it must be okay. You know? When you feel that way, is it okay to verbalize it? Well, certainly it is. Is that the end of the story? No, but we all recognize as we go through life, sometimes we get really frustrated and we look up to heaven and say, what in the world are you thinking, God? How come this is happening to me? But it's Job who's really on trial. The next question is God skirting the issues by going down this path, which he does for 3 chapters, or is he getting to the main point? Is God trying to humiliate Job with a list of his grave sins or of God's great accomplishments? What do you think? Is he skirting the issues? What's the issue in Job's life?
Unfair punishment.
Mm-hmm. Unfair, undeserved punishment. Yeah. It's one of the key questions that humankind has is, why does evil exist? And why am I sometimes unjustly caught up in somebody else's evil? You know, a drunk driver's going down the road and they crash into you or one of your relatives and they're the ones who suffer. Is that fair? You know? You know, one of the things that happened early on is that with the AIDS infection is that there were people who got it because it's a sexually transmitted disease by sex, but there were other people who got it because before they started isolating those things from the blood transfusion pool, they would get it through a blood transfusion. Is that fair? They didn't do anything wrong. They were getting something for help. And it's this question of fairness and unfairness in this world, and how does God make sense of that? So what is God's answer? Does God reveal specific reasons why Job has suffered? Does he say, yeah, Satan and I had a conversation, and he never tells Job, at least now. Somebody was told because it's in the beginning of the book of Job, but what is God pointing to in these questions? Have you?
Well, his greatness and our need of him, turning to him.
Yeah, what does God see? The whole picture.
Right. Yeah.
What do we see? A pinpoint.
That's
know.
that one on the weaving, the poem on the weaving. That,
Yeah.
you know, you see the back of it, and it's all a bunch of little threads. But when you turn it around, you see the pattern.
You see the pattern, the beauty, and yeah, and it's just this that you and I don't always understand things from our perspective, because it is a very limited and narrow perspective. We've got blinders on that don't allow us to see everything, and so what does that call for? It calls for faith. Faith is trust, right? Even when you don't sometimes understand. What's Job's response? And this is very telling where Job ends up here. So go to chapter 40. And would somebody, we read 6 to 9 before, but would you read verses 1 to 5? Because this is one of Job's answers. He only answers a couple times, and this is one of them, the first one.
The Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more.
So what's Job's response?
He knows he doesn't have the answers.
I don't have the answer. So I put my hand over my mouth. He's talking about silencing himself in the questions. And the other place is at the very end of the book, chapter 42. And kind of to set the context, look at the last couple of verses of 41, where it says, nothing on earth is his equal, a creature without fear. So he's talking about, this is the interesting one about people think it's a dragon. We don't really know what it is, you know. Could it have been some kind of dinosaur? That's been suggested. Because smoke pours from its nostrils in verse 20, and his breath sets coals ablaze and flames dart from his mouth. Sounds kind of like a dragon to me, right? And we know that there are animals who can spit fire, so could there be someone that was extinct here? And so he's describing that, and his undersides are like jagged potsherds. So what's that? Real heavy scales, but a potsherd is, of course, much more impervious than a fish scale. Leaving a trail in the mud like a threshing sledge, that would be perhaps his tail being described. As he's moving along, he makes the depths turn like boiling. But now that's the last animal that God describes, and here comes Job. So somebody want to read verses 1 to 6 of chapter 42.
Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears had heard you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes.
So what's God's answer? See me.
Yeah.
Basically, just see me. And it's also interesting that the answer to Job's question is the Sunday school answer that usually Mark always gives us. It's Jesus, right? It's God. He says, it's me that's the answer. Your trust, your belief, your conviction that I'm your God is the answer. You're not going to understand all this, but if you trust me, if you've seen me, and that's what Job says, that's enough for me. It's interesting, if you haven't looked at Job for a little bit, that then he calls, God says to Eliphaz, the Temanite, I'm angry with you and your two friends. So the three guys who are giving him bad advice, he says, because you've not spoken me what is right as my servant Job has. So take 7 bulls, 7 rams, go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer, and not with dealing with you according to your folly. And so in verse 10 it says, after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord made him prosperous again, gave him twice as much as before. But it's interesting that Job prays for his end. This fits very well with our epistle lesson this week, because we're still in Romans, and this is about what do you do with your enemies? You know, somebody who's not treated you right or well. And Job prays for the people who are giving him bad advice.
And that advice really relates to his action, like
You got to do this, Job. You
instead
gotta do
of
this.
faith, it's
Yeah.
acts.
So what kind of questions have you asked God when you didn't understand the circumstances of your life?
Well, the one thing that I always felt was a good deal is I could be angry. and say why. I might get the answer and I might not. But if I'm gonna have communication with God, I should let him know what my feelings are, even though he already knows. But the whole idea is, you'll get an answer. Maybe not now, maybe later, but you get an answer. And I think that whole idea of knowing that he's there for us is huge, because that really helps in a lot of ways when you're dealing with grief, when you're dealing with frustration, is knowing that he's there, even if you don't like what's happening.
A pair of psalms that go together are Psalms 42 and 43. And it's this, because the reason they go together is because they have a common refrain. And if you go there once, they'll just kind of point you to those. I think it carries the same kind of attitude that I don't always understand, but I'm going to trust you, God. And the psalmist talks to himself, which I do a lot. The other day I was cutting the grass, and Jerry said, "Who are you talking to out there?" Because I talk out loud. Usually the mower covers, but she said, "Boy, you were really getting excited about something." I explained to her what it was. But the psalmist talks to himself, and if you look at the beginning of Psalm 42, it says, "A deer pants for streams of water, my soul pants for you, my soul thirsts for God, where can I go and meet with God?" Then he talks about people saying, "Where is your God?" But then the self-talk comes, and it's the one that's repeated in verse 5. "Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God." So it's there, it's in verse 11, and then when you go to chapter 40, or Psalm 43, it's in verse 5 there as well. And it's just this struggle of trying to understand something I don't understand. And what does he say is to put your hope in God? So that's the last question. Where do you, like Job, most clearly see God? Where do you, like Job, most clearly see God?
In his creation, in the world.
Well, you can see it, but he's more hidden in his creation. And you can only learn about God, at least what Paul says about it in Romans 1, is we can figure out that God's pretty smart, because it's well designed, and that he's pretty powerful, that it all came to be. But where do you meet God personally?
In the Bible.
Where's Mark when you need him? Jesus. Right? Jesus is God's revelation of his very heart for us in a way that we can see, feel, understand, and touch. One of my favorite stories, a guy by the name of Guy Dowd, he was Teacher of the Year, and he wrote a book about some of his experiences and about how he really struggled growing up in a home, and what he said was, he uses this phrase, "I needed a Jesus with skin on." I knew about Jesus, but I needed a Jesus without skin on. And it was his 8th grade teacher who became that person for him, and it's just a reminder that we are that for each other sometimes. We're the Jesus with skin on. If we truly believe that we're the body of Christ and each one of us are a part of it, then that means that we embody, when we live in the love of Jesus, we embody, when we live in the love of Jesus, his presence in this world. And so when you think about people who have been particularly significant in your life, who are Christian and lived out their faith in a way that really blessed you, then you say, that was one of the way Jesus expressed himself to me. And for me, I always think about, and I use this phrase fairly often, find your place at the foot of the cross. Look up in the eyes of your Savior. You want to know how God feels about you, that's where you find out the answer. You don't look in the mirror. You know, it's not what you think of you, it's what God thinks of you. And what the Heavenly Father thinks about you is revealed in Jesus and in His great love for you. And so when I'm dealing with people who are going through Job-like experiences, one of the things I'd like to simply say is that we're broken people who live in a broken world. You know, we're broken people. All of us have our own frailties and failings, and it's just who we are. And we live in a broken world. It's not just us, but you know, we typically summon up the devil, the world, and our flesh. So not only do our own desires get us into trouble, but other people's desires who, because of their neglect or intention, hurt us. And then there's the devil, who is always prowling around like the roaring lion, seeking to devour someone. So we got those enemies around us. We're broken people in a broken world. But what we have is the revelation of who God is. Our God is the almighty, all-powerful, all-gracious God, who, I like the way Tim Keller says it. He says, when you see yourself as God sees you, you realize that you are more sinful than you ever wanted to believe. But when you see His love for you in Jesus, you know that you are more loved than you could ever possibly deserve. And that's the context in which we live our lives as we make our journey through this world. It's the understanding that strengthens us when we're going through a difficult time. Is, I might say, I don't know what the heck you're doing, God, but I trust you love me because I've seen it in Jesus. And that's the faith and life that He calls us to. And it's that faith and life that gives us the strength to do what we're going to reflect on a little bit more in the sermon this week, and that is the letter to the Romans. We're not going to need a lot of context here for this one because it's a section. And remember at the beginning of the book of chapter 12, he started out saying, live a transformed life, offer your body as a living sacrifice. And then he starts enumerating the different ways you and I do that. So the first one is, take a sober look at yourself. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. So the first thing that God transforms is the way we look at ourselves. Then he says to love sincerely from the heart. And that's about the love that we share with one another. And that's called to be a sincere love. But it's about brothers and sisters in the faith, and that's where we were last. And then he moves on to, now you got to love your enemies. And that's where he's at in these passages. So let's read it responsibly. Okay. Do not repay anyone evil for evil.
Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone.
If it's possible, as far as it depends on you,
Live at peace with everyone.
do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath.
For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord.
On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him.
If he is thirsty, give him something to drink.
In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head.
Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Okay, reflection. Who's the hardest person you've ever been called to love and forgive? And if you're like me, you may not want to share that.
I've had a few situations in some places where I worked where I had a difficulty with other instructors, and I found that being nice to them, as much as it didn't resolve their anger, it gave me peace and it made them look really bad. So, without getting into details, but that I had to pull one aside and said, you know, just because I'm nice and I said nice things about you, doesn't mean that they don't know what you did to me. And you're looking really like an idiot, you know, but that's your problem, not mine. But that's something I think, my mother always taught me that, to be nice to people who are even bad. And it really did heap coals of burning fire on their heads, which was interesting because they stepped in it. And I didn't say anything until they gave me a hard time, and then I pointed it out to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had experience like that. It's heartbreaking because you want to be able to be the right kind of person to everyone, and to think that somebody is jealous of you for one reason or another, you know, and tries to pull something on you. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think the time when very often it's hard is when you find people who betray you, go behind your back, that kind of thing, and it's just, it's hard not to say, I hope you get what's coming to you. You know, it's just so hard. How does the sacrificial love respond to those who are outside, maybe even hostile to the family of faith?
Well, it shows them what they're missing. You know, it's what Margie was saying. It can backfire on them, you know, that their hostility can backfire on them, but then they can also see that they can't get your goat because you're just gonna love them back, and which just probably irritates you.
Irritates. And and that's one of those places where, you know, Isaiah's revelation that all our filthiness is like righteous or like dirty rags, is that there's a part of you who says, I'm going to love you because, and I'm going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and there's a part of me that says, I hope it just drives you nuts. You know? All of our rights, so sometimes even our good things are tainted a little bit, because we can't help having that feeling of sometimes, you know, that, oh, I just hope this drives you nuts. And we're going to get to this actually in the next week as well, because the next week he's going to start talking about how you deal with the government and right? And you have to realize that who's Paul writing to? He's writing to the Romans. What's the seat of the government? It's right. What are Christians going through all around the world at this time? It's persecution. And yet he'll say, you know, obey the authorities that are set over you. And you say, well, how could you say that, Paul? You know. And when he unpacks that in other places, it's because God expects us to be a witness to the world and how we handle things, and the early Christians were a witness to the world.
But my understanding is there's always that exception. You obey the authorities unless or until they tell you to do something
Correct.
against my word.
Absolutely. That's Acts 5:29. That's we must obey God rather than men. That's when they tell Peter he's got to shut up and he can't talk about the risen Christ anymore, and he says, you know. And while they had the authority, yes, God always trumps everybody. That's why I like to say it. You know. When I'm teaching the fourth commandment, I'll say, is there any time when you should disobey a parent? And, you know, most of the kids would say, well, no. And I say, well, what if they told you to, you know, sell drugs for them so that, because they know that if you get caught, you're only going to go to juvie and probably get let go. I mean, people use kids that way, you know. That's why they have sometimes children they know do stuff that they themselves would do, but if they get caught, it means they're going to go to prison with a felony. But if their kid gets caught, what do you do? What do you do? You know, and the whole issue of sexual abuse, and especially with children. So teaching children to say no. Teaching them when it's appropriate and how it's appropriate, because sometimes that sexual abuse can come from your own parents. So is there an appropriate time to say no? Obviously there are appropriate times to say no. But only because you're deferring to God who's greater one. But it's just a reminder that that it's being kind to even those who are hostile. Paul is encouraging them to do here. And he gets very specific as what does this look like? That's the next question. How do verses 18 to 21 describe what it means to do what is right in the eyes, should say, do what is right in the eyes of everyone? So if you take them one by one. So he says, do what's right in the eyes of everyone. The problem is that does that everyone mean I got to please everybody because it kind of reminds me of justifications I have heard from people for doing something. Well, I'm only doing it because I love them. Right? So you can say about euthanasia, I'm only doing it because I love them. The old Alabama song, if loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right, kind of thing. But it's a loving, and love is a principle, it's a loving thing to do. The problem is that love has to be informed. It has to be guided, it has to be directed, and here you've got some specific direction. So, verse 18, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. What does that mean? What's your job in a broken relationship?
To repair it, mediator.
To do the best you can to repair it. But if you have a broken relationship with somebody who refuses to pick up the phone when you call, who refuses to answer the door when you're standing there knocking and you know they're home, and this is a very practical thing. I remember one gal in my first congregation said, Pastor, I don't know if I can take communion anymore. And I said, what do you mean you can't take communion anymore? Well, it says, first and go be reconciled to your brother, and then, well, it says first go give your gift at the altar. Before you give your gift at the altar, first go and be reconciled, because otherwise your gift is tainted, it's not good. And we use that passage to say, well, if you're going to come to the Lord's Supper and say, God, I want you to forgive me, or in your confession you say, God, I want you to forgive me, but you're holding something against somebody else, it's forgive as I have forgiven. And if you're holding that bitterness in your heart, then you're saying to God, I really don't want to be forgiven, because I don't want to let your forgiveness flow through me. It's going to stop with me. And God says, no, that's not right. But what she was struggling with was this, that there was somebody else that she had apparently offended, because they just kind of stopped talking to her. And it was one of those where she said, I've tried to call her, she never picks up the phone. I've gone over there when I know she's home and she never answers the door. And I can't get this relationship reconciled, so I don't feel I should come to the Lord's Supper until this relationship is reconciled. And that's when I brought her to this passage and said, no, it says, as far as it depends on you. But you also have to realize that forgiveness is one side. I can forgive you even though we're not reconciled. And forgiving then means I've let go of the bitterness, the hurt in my heart. I'm not going to let my anger with you control how I live my life and the impact it has on other relationships. I'm sure you've run into people who are holding on to some kind of bitterness, and it's just tough to be in a relationship with them. But reconciliation, contrary to forgiveness, requires two people. Reconciliation can't happen unless both people want it to happen. And so Paul says here, the Spirit says, as far as it depends on you, you make every effort you can, but if it comes to that point where that other person won't engage with you, well, then you've done what you can do. and don't carry that burden anymore. And you can always leave the door open. And that's kind of what I encourage her to do, is to write a letter and just say, I've tried to reach out to you and I haven't been able to connect with you, and and I just want you to know the door is always open. And if you want to restore a relationship, I'm ready and willing to do that. And it just keeps that door open, as in you don't shut the door, but you hold that door open in that relationship, as far as it depends on you. So that's the first thing he says. Now, he says, don't take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it's written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. That's the second thing he tells us to do, in doing what's right in the eyes of everyone. And that is, don't get revenge. Don't pay back. No tit for tat. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, people will say, is in the Bible too. Yes, but that was for a specific reason and for a specific time. The eye for eye and tooth for tooth was for a time when you didn't have a government. For when the people came out of the land of Israel, and the idea was that somebody got exactly what they were supposed to get. You would call it, in our language, somewhat restorative justice, that you have to pay what you took away. So if you break a window, you got to pay for the window to be repaired. And it was this equalizing the damage kind of thing. But once they had a king, then it wasn't into everybody else's hand, eye for an eye, for tooth. And Jesus refers to that one and says, you've heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you to love your enemies. So if you're going to do this, not take revenge but leave room for God's wrath, what does that mean? You trust
Then he'll do it.
that in his time and in his way, he will do it. It might be sometime during this life, or it might be on the day of judgment. But I'm not going to tell God what he should do. I'm going to let him do it in his own time, in his own way. And so even that is an act of trust, that all will be made right again, but in God's time. Verse 20. That's pretty easy to understand. What do you do for an enemy?
Take care of them.
You're still kind to them. And you continue to keep that door open. I remember I had a lady in a congregation whose kids just cut her out, and grandkids, and she wasn't able to see them. And she asked me, should I still send them birthday cards and Christmas cards, because they never respond, they never send a thank you, they never whatever. And I said, yes. Because your response shouldn't depend, what you do shouldn't depend on what they do. Do you still love them in your heart? Yes. Do you still want what's best for them? Yes. Then you keep sending them.
This kind of thing used to happen to me earlier on in my nursing career when I worked in intensive care, and we would have a kid come in who was seriously injured, but he had done some kind of a crime. So he's shackled to the bed with handcuffs, but we would provide him care. I remember doing peritoneal dialysis on this one kid who was just a whole other thing you don't even want to know. For hours and hours, and taking care of them, dressing their wounds and giving them their medication or feeding them because they couldn't eat because they were chained to the wall.
To the wall.
I mean, it's the same kind of a thing. it didn't matter to me what he had done. I don't condone criminal behavior,
Right,
of course, but
right.
I'm there to take care of him, not what he did. So,
Yeah, and you can think of that in I think when I saw it a number of times when it came to a medical issue was when AIDS first came down. And the Christian community responded in two different ways. There were those who said they're getting what they deserve, good for them. You know, basically I hope they all die, you know. But there was a whole nother group of Christians who said, no, what have Christians always done in the past is they've gone to those who were in need and served their needs. And so there was a whole other group of Christians who identified the AIDS community as a community that they were going to show love and care to. And it's a real challenge, you know, because even if you don't agree with somebody's lifestyle and behavior that got them into that situation, they're still one of God's creatures, you know. And God calls us to be kind to them, even if we consider them an enemy of the faith, an enemy of God, or an enemy to us. I feel incredibly appreciative of our first responders, the police, the paramedics who go into communities, firefighters who often they have to have somebody watching their back because the very people they're trying to help, their friends and family might attack them. And it's a very tough situation when you know you're there to help somebody who probably is in a situation where they are in need of help because of something they've done either to themselves or somebody else, but it doesn't matter, you know. You're there to care. And sometimes that's really, really, really difficult. I remember one nurse who worked in a cardiac unit who she expressed her frustration one time at a repeat customer who was like 400 pounds and, you know, smoked and, you know, and she was like, just really, you know? You're not going to do anything to change your, and then you're going to use all of these resources that could be used for somebody who's taking care of their body, and you know, and it's tough. It's tough. And maybe nurses often are stuck in that position. I remember another gal whose daughter was having difficulty conceiving, and she was an OBGYN nurse at St. Joe's, and she said, I just don't get it. There's 12 and 13-year-olds who are popping babies out, and my daughter, who would love to have a child, isn't. And eventually her daughter did, but it was, you know, it was that kind of thing that I think we all struggle with when we see people who we might say don't deserve it get a blessing that we ourselves don't have. But what's our call? Continue to be kind to them. What about that last one? In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. And I'd like you to see that that's not a command, it's a result. Okay? It's not you're supposed to heap burning coals on his head, but this is what happens to that person. And then the principle in all of this is don't be overcome by evil. In other words, don't respond in kind, but overcome evil with good. And again, in the book of Romans, we don't have to go back very far. We've been saying it in every absolution. Since we started this book of Romans, we use those two passages. When we were still weak, God died for the ungodly. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So where do we see somebody who doesn't give us what we deserve?
Jesus.
And whenever God gives us a command like this, it's what I always find interesting is that it's not something that either God or Jesus hasn't done himself. And you can see expressions of it all through the Old Testament. You know. But you see it most in Jesus. First word from the cross. People nailed him there. And he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He prays for them. One of the things you find about Jesus is he practices what he preaches. And then the question in terms of personal application, when you read a passage like this with these commands, is which one do you most need to hear today? And then what relationship in your life most needs the application of these various commands? And that changes obviously from year to year, from month to month, from decade to decade, depending on the relationships God puts us in. And a practice when you're struggling with something like this, and this is just a good practice anyway, it's something I like to do when I'm doing my Bible reading, is to pray the scriptures. And so the way I would pray it, I'll just give you a sample of what I would do with something like this. It's just off the top of my head. I just start with the first verse. Lord, I thank you that you have not repaid everyone who has done evil to you with evil, but instead you've overcome evil with good. The blessing of your Son's life, death, and resurrection. And as he did right in the eyes of everyone, I ask that you would enable me in the power of your Spirit to do right in the eyes of everyone. If there's anybody I need to reach out to restore peace, I'd ask that you'd make me aware of those people, and that you would open my eyes to see what I can do to possibly restore that peace. And then to also have the wisdom to know if that other person isn't going to respond, to know when to throw in the towel and say, I've done everything I can do, so that I can live at peace in that relationship. And Lord, there's people who often take advantage of me and do things that could easily make me angry and respond in anger. And I ask that you give me your will in your heart so that I don't repay evil with evil. But instead that if I have an opportunity, reach out to that person and provide something that they need, so that in my love they can see your love. And I pray that those who experience my love when they don't deserve it will be disturbed, will be convicted, and will be drawn to know you, to love you, and to experience that same forgiveness from you. Lord, help me to be an instrument of your peace so that evil might be overcome with good. In your name I pray. Amen. So that's just kind of a practice. Praying the scripture is just kind of a wonderful practice if you're doing a Bible reading, and ask God to help you put those words into practice. Well, let's head on to the gospel lesson, which is the walking on water after the feeding of the 5,000. And while you're reading, I'm going to step out and step back in again. So let's start with the first verse there. Immediately
Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied,
tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and began to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You have little faith, he said. Why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God.
Okay, how comfortable are you around water? Love it, fear it, play in it, take risks in or on it.
Never learned how to swim, so,
Yeah.
but I was on a boat on Sunday.
Really?
Not, I have no use for water except to drink it or take a shower.
Oh, man. You don't know what you're missing.
I'm fine with water, but I'm discovering the ocean is not my friend.
Not your friend.
No, I don't like swimming in seawater, and I get motion sick on oceans. I mean, big boats are a problem for me. Little boats, I'm fine. So it's much more of a motion sickness thing than not wanting to be there.
I've always enjoyed water
Yeah.
and swimming. I was in water ballet 3 years ago, and that's like swimming upside down.
Yep,
and
Sure.
stuff
yep.
like that. So I really enjoyed it.
I
Did
like
you see
looking
his
at
hand
it.
up over
It's
here?
nice to look
Huh?
at.
What did you want to say, Ed?
No, just like you.
Oh, motion sick?
Oh, that-
Yeah.
And like Sandy, I don't like swimming either.
Oh,
No
I ended
swimming,
up in
no
the lake
nothing.
many times
what about you though?
when I was older.
Huh? Do you like the water?
You're what?
Yeah.
You grew up in the ocean.
Well, in grade school, in high school too, I had, my boyfriend in high school had a sailboat, so we went sailing a lot.
Yeah.
And it was one of those little, what they call sailfish, you could turn it upside down and you sunbathe on the bottom and then you turn it
Back up again.
Yeah, so.
One of the good stories is when my brother wanted Ed to he wanted him to jump into a deep lake. And he put like 3 life jackets on. Ed still wanted no part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I grew
But he
up
did water ski.
around water all the time, so I loved water. I was thinking as I'm walking through the VW exhibit at German Fest. I just remember we shared driving down to the old natatorium in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
That's where I had my first swimming lessons, and there's a little spot behind the back seat that 2 of us had to sit. Obviously, you couldn't do that now, but in order to get everybody in the car when it was the other people's turn to drive. And I started water skiing when I first tried it when I was 5, and I didn't make it. But 4th grade, I started water skiing, did the slaloming, knee boards, all that kind of fun stuff. Yeah, never got off a jump. That would be fun, but yeah, no, I just loved and grew up around water, and so obviously that's a part of our family tradition because Saturday is day at the lake and everybody will be swimming and the little ones will be jumping in and out, some with no life preservers at all because I learned to swim early and often, yes.
What surprises me is recently now, we've had several deaths off of Lake Michigan. And the one with this woman, a paddle boarder, and she didn't have her life jacket on.
Yeah,
And then there's some others. And when you do something, when it comes to Lake Michigan, and there's so many undercurrents and
oh
stuff,
yeah, yeah,
and the whole idea that people feel that they, no matter whether you can swim or not,
yeah.
you still have to have caution. And it just breaks your heart because you know these people love water.
Yeah, there was a story in the, you make me think about the guy, one of Obama's chefs who died in the water out there and he didn't have a life vest on. Yeah, it depends on the lake. If I'm on a lake, I usually won't wear a life vest, but if I'm in someplace like Lake Michigan, I'm going to have a life vest on because you just never know what's going to happen.
One of my favorite stories and worst experiences is on my honeymoon. We were in Hawaii. It hadn't been in the ocean, for years. And Chuck and I went to the beach in front of the hotel next to us, and First of all, he's walking into the ocean and he's got his sunglasses on, and I'm like, don't you want to leave your sunglasses up by the towel? When he gets, right then, he's like, no, I'm fine. He gets slipped in the back, hit in the back with a wave, comes up, glasses are gone. It's like, okay, well, there you go. And with that, I get hit by a wave, and I had this swimming suit, and it had this zipper in the front of it. The zipper went all the way down. The bottom of my swimming suit, you guys might not know this, but in women's swimming suits, they put this weird little pocket right in the bottom, filled up with sand. So I stand up, my swimming suit is wide open, and the crotch is at my knees because it's loaded with sand. So I immediately go underwater, where the waves are now rolling me in and rolling me out. And
That's so fun now.
oh my God, and I'm screaming to Chuck, bring me my t-shirt, I can't come out of the water. And there's these Hawaiians sitting on the beach, because all the beaches in Hawaii are public property.
Right.
So the Hawaiians are all sitting on the beach just watching me, and I'm like, oh my God, just get me off this beach.
All right, why might Jesus have separated himself from the other disciples at this time? Now this, you have to know, is the context for so what was it that he was trying to get away from?
Well, the 5,000.
5,000.
Why?
5,000.
Well, because they kept following him.
But why was he trying to get off by himself?
Because of his cousin.
John the Baptist.
Yeah.
John the Baptist had died, and so he tried to get away. It didn't work. He was with the 5,000. And now it tells us that he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. How might the disciples' emotions have shifted during this experience? So first, when they get into the boat, what do you think they were maybe thinking? Well, we got a bunch of fishermen with us.
Let's go fishing.
Let's go, on the Sea of Galilee, a sea that they would have been very familiar with. Then they see Jesus. Well, it talks about being buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And if you've ever been in a boat, when you don't seem to be making any headway, that's not a lot of fun.
Yes, but they apparently weren't thinking, how's Jesus going to catch up with us, that we're out in the middle of the lake?
Nope.
Duh.
No, maybe they were
No, maybe they
thinking,
didn't.
where the heck
Maybe they
is
were
it?
trying to get back to shore, but the wind was buffeting them, and they couldn't get back.
So we don't know how fearful they were at that particular moment, but it does tell us exactly what they're feeling in verse 26. They were terrified, and they cried out in fear. So Jesus calls to them and says, take courage, it's I, don't be afraid. So what would they have felt then? Well, he just
More in
fed,
amazement.
yeah, he just fed 5,000 people with a couple loaves of bread and fish. If Jesus is with you, they've learned that lesson. He's the best resource ever. And then Peter says, tell me to come to you on the water. How do you think the other disciples felt then?
Kind of like the college student who thinks he knows it all.
Younger.
What are you doing asking if you can walk on
Yeah.
water too? Who do you think you are?
And sometimes in those kind of situations, there's probably another one who says, why didn't I think of that first?
Oh, there's that.
Right? Who knows? But anyways, Peter obviously felt pretty confident. And then, of course, in verse 30, he's got another feeling. It says, when he saw the wind, which a lot of preachers go down the track. Well, he took his eyes off of Jesus, right? So he wasn't focused on Jesus. He was focused on his surroundings. And now he's really scared.
What body of water was this?
Sea of Galilee.
And is it prone to storms like that?
Yes, it can have things come up pretty quick. But it's also a sea they would have been pretty familiar with. Again, you've got at least two sets of fishing brothers who were professional fishermen, so they were well aware of if you're going to have somebody out there. Of course, sometimes those guys get a little overconfident, well, I can handle anything,
Well, and then the ones who aren't fishermen are out there going, what the heck? Why are we out
Why are we
there?
And then Jesus catches him and says, you have little faith, why did you doubt? So there's another feeling of doubt. The point is there's a whole set of emotions that run through this whole experience, you know. And so the question is, when you start to sink, do you reach out to Jesus or try to swim on your own?
I might have answered that differently when you're younger, but I think after you've lived a bit, you know exactly where you need to get the help.
Sometimes I think I find myself swimming on my own until I realize
When you have
I'm not making any headway here, you know, the wind's against me, and then I need,
And I'm exhausted.
so I need some other help. Yeah, sometimes it's when we've reached the end of our resources that we look for other resources. And, you know, one of the things, John Ortberg wrote a book with this title on it, You Gotta Get Out of the Boat. And his point was that where is it that God is calling you to step out in faith sometimes when you're just not sure what to do, where it's going to go. When you step out of your comfort zone and walk in faith in Him. So because I'm wrapping up my time at St. John's and in Bible class today, I think about that sometimes when I came back here. There were some people who told me, some other brother pastors, who said, you know, well, pastors shouldn't go back to the congregation that they were in. And the ones who said, have you ever heard of anything like that turning out well? I said, yeah, actually, the first congregation I went to was Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Auroreville and Trinity and Forth, and I succeeded a fellow by the name of Roger Moldenauer. Roger Moldenauer had been there 2 times. He'd been there for about 4 years at the first time, and then he went out, he took a call to Wyoming or someplace out west. And they had called during that whole time and not gotten a pastor, and somebody said, well, I'm not sure he's really happy out there, why don't we call him back? So they did, and he came. And he served for another 5 years before then he went down to work for the Concordia Historical Institute. He was really into history, but he's just a really good guy. I had an opportunity to meet him a number of times at a couple of anniversaries there, and just a really good guy. Said, yeah, I know a guy who did that. You know? So I wasn't afraid of it like some people thought I should be. And, huh?
Good.
No. And I obviously did not know that that opportunity was going to present itself when I first started talking about retiring from Emmanuel. So, it definitely was not on the radar at all. But sometimes God calls you to step out of your comfort zone, to do something that's a little unusual, or that others might say, well, why are you doing that? You know? So, well, that's our time today. So let's close with a word of prayer, if we can. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we know we weren't there when you laid out the earth's foundation. And we don't see everything from your perspective, nor do we always trust you and your answers to be correct, good, and whole. And like Job, we just ask that you would help us to surrender our hearts to your will, to trust that in your love for us in Jesus, you will always do what's right for us. And Lord, there's so many waves and winds that we could give our attention to that would upset our trust in you, that would lead us to doubt. But today we ask that through the power of your word and the power of your spirit, you would confirm and affirm that confident faith that we have in your love and grace for us as we've seen it in your Son, Jesus. And it's in that love and grace that we ask you to do what he did, to love and forgive even enemies, to reflect the same kind of gracious, unconditional, and undeserved love that you have given to us first by your visit to our hearts. So bless us as we go from here this day to be a Jesus with skin on in somebody else's life as we reflect that trust, that faith, that life into the lives of others around us. We commit it into your hands for the sake of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Well, you all have a good day.
You all too.